Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagneGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagneGrip.com.
Attention first responders, ready for a new challenge? You can turn your leadership skills into deliciousness by becoming a Firehouse Subs restaurant owner. First responders will receive a $100,000 cash incentive to help open their restaurant. Continue serving after service. Visit FirehouseSubsFranchising.com today.
So good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on wherever and whenever you are listening. I always start with gratitude, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in to the Perspectives on Leadership podcast, brought to you by Fire Engineering. I say it every time we're doing this. You have your choice of which podcast to listen to, and we are honored. I am honored that you're choosing to listen to this one. And we worked hard for the people that are listening. We work hard for the listener to make sure they walk away with tactical things, not just a presentation, as it were. My name is Steve Shaw. I'm very proud to be the Deputy Fire Chief for the Town of Jupiter Fire Rescue Department, after just retiring after about just shy of 25 years from Fort Lauderdale Fire Rescue. I'm honored to be part of the Fire Engineering family as an author, presenter at FDIC, and part of this podcast. So thank you for once again joining us. Chief Halton, I say this all the time as well. Chief Halton always told me that this is a tactics conference and we got to think tactically. So whatever we talk about, whatever we present on, whatever we have a class on, how is the listener, the student, the attendee going to practically deploy what you're talking about? So that's what we go through with here, and that's what the forefront is on our minds when we talk about these things. Perspective is my passion and my personal journey as a student of leadership. I'm always fascinated about people's individual perspectives on leadership. And that's what the goal of this podcast is to deep dive into things and people in the fire service and outside the fire service on a specific topic or things we associate with leadership, and just talk about it, dive deep, and have those conversations. So thank you to Diane Rothschild, David Rhodes, and the Clarion team for allowing me to keep this platform. And thanks to my department, Jupiter Fire Rescue Department, and my fire chief, Chief Donato, for allowing me to continue to do this so I can keep on passing it on to my brothers and sisters in the fire service. So as presenters, all presenters at FDIC are also students. We attend classes in addition to presenting. So the last time around in April of 2024 was no different. And it's always a challenge. And if you've been there, you know the challenge. You're looking at all the courses and all the amazing lineups, and you're like, man, which one do I choose? There are so many. And it's bittersweet when you finally choose that one because you're missing out on so many others. So this last time around, one class that caught my eye was Aggressive EMS Treatment for the Fire Victim by Stephen Wilcox from the Colony, Texas. So when I saw that, I'm like, oh yeah, I'm going to that. Let's go. If you don't know me, I'm a paramedic, former paramedic instructor, and a nurse as well. So I'm all about the EMS side, especially fire-based EMS. I was EMS chief during COVID, walked away with tons of knowledge and experience from that time. So and of all the things we do in the fire service, I love it all. And I do love the EMS part of what we do, and I'm a big advocate for it. So before I introduce Steve, there were a few things I was thinking about, 3 things I was thinking about prior to us starting this conversation. The first thing is EMS is, generally speaking, for a large part of the country, a large part of Florida especially, it's a major part of what we do. And I'm surprised at how many people still out there in the world just don't know what we do. When you talk to residents, people that work around your town or city, they just don't know what we do and the impact that has. Florida, for example, is the most dominated EMS-based system in the nation. So I think it's like 95-ish% of people get EMS from the fire departments in the state of Florida. My boss actually reminded me of that recently. The second thing is I've met a lot of people, and I'm sure Steve has too when we talk about this, that have chosen in one way, shape, or form to ride the box or ambulance or medical rescue, however you want to call it, for an entire career. They ride it for 20, 25, 30 years. And there's a handful that do it with a smile all the way through, that they're the ones we seek out when we have a medical question, no matter what it is. And they're the ones we come running to our families in an emergency. And I think about those individuals and I'm like, man, what makes those guys tick? In other words, how could you ride the box for 20, 25, 30 years and still love it? What's in that? And how do we bottle that and then sell that or sprinkle it on other people? The third thing I was thinking of is the opportunities, and maybe we'll talk about this today, in incorporating EMS into different types of the training we do. And I think that's done some places, but not all. And whether that's technical rescue, extrication, fire training, whatever, my former fire chief always reminded me that, hey, when you're doing a fire scenario, when you're dragging that dummy out, once you're out there, it's not over. How are you treating that victim? And that's very much what we're going to talk about today. It continues on. And there's so many ways to deploy that concept in so many of the training opportunities we have at our disposal. So anyway, those are the things I was thinking about. And I'm going to introduce Steve real quick. So Steve Wilcox is a paramedic and educator who has been in the EMS field for more than 15 years, working in the rural and suburban EMS settings. He's currently an EMS lieutenant for the Colony, Texas Fire Department and a flight paramedic for Care Flight, Texas, and a division chief of EMS for Whitesboro, Texas Fire Department. He holds a Bachelor's of Science in EMS and has presented at conferences locally and internationally. He's extremely passionate about EMS and loves sharing pre-hospital knowledge with other fire, EMS, and healthcare providers. So, Steve, thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk about the recent article you did, your class at FDIC, and I just thank you for your time and to geek out with me a little bit.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah. So, like I said, man, I think I first ran into you, at least formally, at FDIC this last time around. And was that your first time teaching, or have you done before?
At FDIC, that was my first year teaching.
Okay. So let's talk about that for a second. Actually, before we talk about that, walk me through like where you got to where you are today. Like where does the passion for EMS come from? What was your journey like? How did that shape you to where you are today?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that, honestly started in 2007. I was probably a junior in high school. I remember going on vacation. Typically in EMS, you talk to people, you all have that kind of one event that drew you to your career, right? And I remember vividly being with my family at Lake Whitney, which is a lake down in just south of the Metroplex of Texas. But anyways, we were there and there was cardiac arrest on the beach. And I remember everybody jumping into action, seeing the paramedics come, treat and transport the patient. That was my first kind of, interest in EMS and fire. That kind of stemmed on. That went on. And I remember going back home and trying to see if I could volunteer at the local fire department at my hometown. I remember being told, no, not right now, because you're still in high school. So come back after high school. And so that's what I did. In high school, my senior year, I had the whole afternoon to where I wasn't actually going to school. So I enrolled in EMT school, graduated EMT school shortly after graduating high school, and got licensed as an EMT and started working. Honestly, in my, whole goal scheme of things at that point, this was something to do until I got my degree and, I had aspirations of going to med school or into PA or something. So it kind of started out that way. I ended up going on and getting my associates, getting my basics. And I thought, well, we'll do this and I'll work this and see how, if I like it, we'll see what happens. And ironically, love the career, love being an EMT. So I went into paramedic school, graduated in 2010 with my associates of paramedicine. And from then I was already working in a 911 system locally. I'd worked for a little bit of private EMS in those 2 years and hospital based as a ER tech. Ended up working for a nonprofit private company here in my hometown of Whitesboro, EMS there. So it's a rural area, but we provided 2 ambulances that covered about 250 square miles of territory. So I did that and continued on. And, just like a lot of people in private EMS, I kind of wagered whether I was going to go to fire school, what I was going to do. Do I go on, just continue on and maybe go ahead and pursue that PA through bachelor's and all that further education. And 2014, I ended up deciding to go to work for a county-based EMS system. They're very aggressive for EMS-based system, and they, paid well and all that. So went over there, and honestly, where I probably grew the most as a paramedic in my career. And I was only there for a really short time, about 5 years. But it was actually in 2017 that I moved back to my hometown with my family, my wife and kids. And I joined the volunteer fire department here in my hometown, which I talked about when I was in high school, right? So was still working county-based EMS, got on there. At that time, it was a volunteer organization only. And they said, we don't have an EMS license anymore. So we'd like to get our first responder license back. Is that something you could do? So that's something I took on the side. I, got them their BLS first responder organization license back. That later on transformed to an ALS first responder organization, and I was a captain of the department. 2017, about that time, the volunteer organization piqued my interest even more. Do I want to go to career for fire? So started talking about that. Had a lot of guys that I worked with on the EMS side that worked at other fire departments. And one of my best friends, Jonathan Perales, actually came to me. He said, man, I work at the Colony Fire Department and we're looking at doing this single role paramedic thing, so I understand you want to go, try to further your career, maybe make more money and do these things. Maybe, and that's why you're looking. He goes, but if you really like, I know you love EMS. So what if you could do EMS and that's what you rode the ambulance. You didn't rotate to a fire apparatus. And so I held out, honestly. I looked at other departments that were going to put me through fire school, and that's what I kind of had my mindset on. I said, well, I looked up the Colony. I saw what they were all about, their culture, and I thought that was honestly a perfect opportunity for me. So I ended up joining the Colony Fire Department in 2018. I was lucky enough to be hired in the very first group of single role paramedics. From then, it's kind of funny. I was there for a few years. Chief Thompson, really sold this and said that, hey, I want the best of both worlds. We want the best of firefighting. I want my firefighters to be able to focus on firefighting, and I want to have paramedics be able to focus on EMS. All the firefighters there that had been there to this point since existence were all paramedics, but he said, I want them to be focused on firefighting and training, and then I want an EMS group that'll focus on EMS and being good paramedics. So it was kind of awesome being on that forefront. And he said, how about you, he sold to us. He said, I want y'all to take ownership of this. Y'all have the opportunity to kind of mold this and see what it's going to be. And that's what we, really focused on. We ended up creating a mentoring program for our new paramedics that were hired after us, developed an orientation process and all those things above. And so that's, grown over the last 5 to 6 years and to what it is today, which is fully staffed ambulances with single role paramedics of 18 paramedics and all that. And then now we have a promotional process, which is what we just did this last year. And that's when I promoted EMS lieutenant there. In between those, like you said, I fly for CareFly, and I started that actually in 2020. One of those things I'm always trying to do something a little bit better or, better myself and go a little further. And so I thought, well, clinically, I love my job on the ground. I don't want to give it up, but I found an organization that I could fly part-time at that I have to do 24 hours a week. So I went there, grew exponentially clinically. I got my flight paramedic certification and did all those things. And then in the mix of all this, Whitesboro, where I stayed as a volunteer in 2022, decided they were separated from the private service and go buy into EMS full-time because the service was lacking in a lot of areas, and we knew that we wanted better for our citizens. So I was asked at that time to come on part-time with them, and which is where now I'm also the division chief of EMS. So it's kind of where we are today, but it's been a fun journey for sure.
Yeah, it's quite the journey. And you mentioned the Colony and mentioned Chief Scott Thompson, and I've had a chance to talk with him a couple times in the last few months for various reasons. I think I actually may have his book back here. It's right here actually. Yeah, right here, Functional Fire Company. Yep. I hope he gives me some royalties for just plugging him right there. But anyway, but no, in talking with him, there are a lot of things that stood out that you mentioned from the Colony, how recruitment and retention was very powerful over there. And there's something he's doing over there about the culture and that spoke to me. So a lot of what you just said, I'm sure is going to come up in our conversation. But so let me ask you this. Since this was your first time teaching at FDIC, and you had a very unique class, walk me through what that looked like. In other words, not only how was your class, but when people come up afterwards and talk to you, were you looking at any trends you were seeing? How was the discussions afterwards? Anything stood out? How did that adventure go?
So, first and foremost, I honestly owe credit to my battalion chief. I went to FDIC the year before just to go. I had me and another paramedic and him had went to the FDIC. And so obviously I went and loved it. And I thought, man, this is the stage, right? This is where you get. I taught at some local conferences and thought, man, that'd be pretty awesome. And he said, you need to put in. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, next year, you need to put in. You did the CyanoKit stuff. Why don't you put something in? I thought, it's pretty far-fetched. But yeah, and so honestly, I waited and I kind of held off. And then last minute, I said, now I'm going to put in. So I put my class in, and, honestly, if it had not been for him that kind of pushed me to be uncomfortable and to do those things, I don't know that I would have. But so, I put in, and I was extremely lucky, and my class was chosen. And talking about the class and everything, it's whenever I went in, I know that I'm speaking to majority of them are going to be firemen. Jim's has joined in with it. So you may have some guys like myself that were there for EMS, but majority is going to be firemen. But so I was like, how do I make a class, that's going to grab the attention of firemen for EMS, right? For an EMS class, specific class. And at that, an hour and 45 minutes, right? I teach classes at the department. I know it's hard to keep attention for an hour. So an hour and 45 minutes. So anyways, the challenge was there. But yeah, and I thought it went really well. And again, bringing in fire topics, stuff from fire rescue survey, all that data that it really matters. But it kind of, you got to build a story, right? And it's one of those, you're building a story of, okay, why are we doing, why is EMS important in this scenario? Well, it's important because like you said earlier, when you go to the training ground and you pull a victim to the door and everybody turns around and walks back in to continue search, well, that's not realistic. So making sure that we have those avenues and explaining to the firefighters, paramedics, it doesn't matter who you are, whether you are a fire and EMS or a fire EMS-based fire service, or you are running private EMS and you're a fire department. We have to make sure those things are correlating, because if not, the victims are going to suffer. So tying those in, I think really made the difference. And then, discussions afterwards, I think a lot of it was driven towards, and that's the hard thing, I guess, for me to keep in mind was this is what we're used to. This is what we do, even though I've been a part of multiple different departments, and it wasn't always that way. And I explained that in my class. Like, there was definitely lessons I learned prior to coming to the colony that I did not do things this way, but keeping that aspect in mind that, across the nation, we do things vastly, different throughout. So keeping that in mind, but I think that's where most questions were generated from were, hey, our system does X, Y, Z, and that's not what we're doing, but how do we develop that? How do I have those tough conversations and make sure that, we make this a priority? How do I, convince my department to spend $1,300 on a medication that, they don't see that it's necessary. So those were a lot of the conversations. And like I said, it was really good conversations afterwards too.
Yeah, like you were saying, that's one of the things I spoke to you on afterwards is, what does that look like? What does a single role paramedic look like? It's part of what your culture is over there. It's part of what's attracting people as well. So I know that's what the conversation we had afterwards as well. So that's good. And it's what it's about. The presentation is one thing, but those conversations afterwards, the sparking of something interest, the conversation you have even after the conference is over. So specifically from your class, and let's just maybe recap that. Just give us a snapshot of what that was, but from a tactical standpoint from your class, as we're talking about this, we're talking about deployable things. What does a listener here need to know about basic things from your class, like whether it's cyanocator or general treatment? What does that look like?
A lot of it, and I took that class, and it goes back to the basics. And that's what aggressive EMS treatment for the fire victim, and that's what I explained. Most people automatically think, well, we're going to talk about airways, fluid management, all these things. And it is that. It's not taken away from that, but it really starts way before that. And that's the departmental training, preparing for these things. We're not going to just show up and all of a sudden, like, these things are going to happen if we don't prepare and train for them. So having the SOPs in place, what are your procedures? What, like I said, and I give an example. Whenever I worked for the county-based service, I remember one of my last calls there being a structure fire, and ambulance was down the block, and we walk up, and we have no gear with us, and because that's what was that was the standard there. It wasn't, you didn't go to command with all your stuff ready to go. We went to command though, and I said, you have any patients? And he said, not at this time. They're doing search. Well, they're doing search, and then lo and behold, about 2 minutes later, somebody screamed behind me, and I got a man holding his child that's unconscious. So I had severe burns. So that was one of the things that really triggered this. And when I got to the colony and I learned about aggressive firefighting, and then we kind of matched and we said, well, what are we missing here? And that was aggressive EMS culture. And it was not that it wasn't aggressive. It's just a matter of fact that, okay, now that we are making it, we have paramedics are going to do this, and what are their roles going to be? Well, so our roles at that point are, helping run command, having our equipment with us, being ready for victims. That's the number one thing. And And when we do trainings, that we train together, right? So that's another huge thing. If you're not training with your firefighters, whether you're a fire-based EMS system or you're a separate system, we have to make time to train with each other to understand what each other's goals are and how we're going to work together. But all those things transition to obviously the treatment of the patient. Talking about treating the patients, I tell people burns aren't going to kill the patient in the immediate time after. It's going to be the carbon monoxide poison and cyanide poisoning. The treatment for that, is carbon monoxide poison. We're delivering 100% FO2 oxygen. However that needs to be done, we're on a regular BVM, advanced airway. But the big point, and that's what I pushed in the class, is cyanide poisoning is 35 times more toxic than carbon monoxide poisoning. If we treat them with 100% oxygen, that's great. But still, if they have cyanide poisoning, there's very, very likely, if they're in an enclosed container that's been filled with smoke because of all the byproducts that we burn off now, all the synthetic material that's burning inside the structure, then we have to have an antidote for the cyanide poisoning. If we don't, the chance of getting the patient back or them surviving is extremely low. And then presenting that data from fire rescue survey that they had for us is pretty significant, and then kind of going through the rest of it. But that's kind of the meat and potatoes of it, if you will.
Gotcha. Okay. A couple of things you said there were kind of interesting. You mentioned, and you said culture a few times, from where you came from and then where you're going to now. And as we're building this fire department from the ground up where I'm at right now, I think about culture all the time. In fact, I've talked to your boss about that. I talked to my boss about it. I have a lot of conversations on culture and how to build that from the ground up. And you mentioned something like the ambulance being down the street, not really involved in the call. That reminds me of a conversation we just kind of had last month and the month before with Basil and then with Grant Schwalbe about the idea that a lot of times people are going into these situations for search and just searching to search and not really expecting victims, expecting somebody. So even that concept of having the ambulance down the street, are you really part of the scene? Are you really expecting a victim? So I love that you talked about that in terms of the need to be more incorporated into the culture, the scene, an active part of it, not just a passive part, but an active part of it.
Exactly. That's what we tell people in art, and that's what I told them in classes. Just because you're EMS, the whole purpose is to expect victims, right?
Yeah.
That's our number one purpose of being there. So don't be shocked when you get there and there's a victim. And like I said, I was shocked, right? Years ago when that last call, I was shocked, and I shouldn't have been. So
right.
It's moments like that you learn from, you take from, and then again, it's interesting the different cultures you're placed in, and then you're like, aha, like this is what it should be, right? This is the way it needs to be.
Yeah. No, and the other thing you said that I thought was pretty poignant to reiterate and to repeat was that you guys train together. And I remember struggling with that years and years ago before I had my own station, where I felt as if some days I'm like, man, I have to do some training today. I got a rookie on my engine, but I got this medical rescue unit at the station. Man, they're so busy. I don't know if I want to bother them by including them in the training because they're maybe I want them to give them a nap or something. I walked away from that concept a long time ago. I mean, when I had my own station, just like you were saying, we all trained together. Everything, no matter what it was, we trained as a team, and that built camaraderie, it built communication, it built the culture that you're referring to. So I love that you said that part too. You don't separate the training. Everybody trains. So if anybody's listening, they're thinking about these things, ask yourself what that looks like in your station, what that looks like in your company, what that looks like in your department. But I'm glad you said that, man. So but that concept of training together.
Absolutely.
In terms of let's go drift a little bit, and in terms of like EMS portions out there, and we talked about this a little bit, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. I mentioned earlier that there's some guys that I've worked with, and it's a bell curve. It always is. You have some guys that are rock stars that for whatever reason nothing gets to them, and they can be on that box or be a medic or be in a busy house for years, decades, and for some reason it's like water off a duck's back. They just thrive in it. They're the go-getters, the people that you ask questions to. And it's like, how do you make that? And then the other side, there's the ones that just get burnt out on a very short time frame. But going back to the good part of that, in your opinion, what does that look like? In other words, what makes that cat, what makes that guy or girl that's that person that can do that and survive a career focusing on EMS? And whether that's as a private responder, whether that's on a fire-based EMS, sole paramedic, whatever, what goes into making that person that person?
Yeah, and it is, like you said, it's a curve. It's all over the place. And even as working as a single role paramedic at the colony, we still have guys that are on the fire side that they like EMS. Now, you told them about you be on the box for 25 years, you're going to struggle probably to find most of them. They're going to tell you, yeah, no thanks. But there are those out there, and I think it's just where our passions really lie. There's passions for the fire side, and some got into and that's the whole thing that you hear is, well, I got in to be a fireman, I didn't get in to be a paramedic. Or but I think you also see the other side, and we do when we hire in our process for single role medics, we're getting some that are firemen, and they come to us, and of course our first question is, are you what's your purpose? Are you here trying to get on the EMS side and trying to transition to the fire side, or is EMS really your passion? And we get both. We have some that will come in and say, like, I've been on a fire department because at the time that was the only way to do, to make a living and to do these things and work in a structured system. But my passion's EMS, and that's all I want to do. I want to come work for you and be on the ambulance, and that's my job. And so I think it's just different personalities and different passions. And I think that, like you said, there's even some in the EMS side that really probably have no business staying in the EMS side because that's not their passion. And you get to them, they're disgruntled. They, don't look the part. Their boots are undone, their shirt's undone, and that's obviously not how us or our citizens or as patients. Nobody wants to see anybody. So I think that's where it really lies, though, is the person's passion.
So let's talk about that in a little bit deeper. So in terms of like those people, let's say the middle ground, those people that are, let's use Florida, for example, because Florida is again, 95% fire-based EMS. You got a lot of guys that kind of like you said, they start off wanting to be firefighters or want to provide the engine or suppression. And like most of us, and myself included, we knew we had to go to paramedic school because at the time we could not get hired unless we were a paramedic. So we did that because out of necessity. Right. Now, a lot of us grew to love it. Like for me, I love it. I love being a medic. I love the work. I love everything from the stuff I was doing in the field, teaching it to other people. And I like being the guy that I was asked questions even off the job. Like I love being able to weigh in on experiences from the hospital, from medics, to my family, my friends when they asked. It felt good. So I guess, as we keep talking about this, if you got those people at your station or your crew, how do you change their perspectives? What can people like us do to, I don't know, bring attention, make this more, advocate for EMS, make it more quote unquote sexy? What does that look like? Where does your mind go?
I think a lot of it is having medical control involvement. How much is your medical control involved? And really and truly, to me, it's are we always trying to do something better, right? I think when you got guys that it's the same thing, nothing's changing. Maybe they're bored, maybe they just it's not doesn't pique their interest at all. And then, like you said, how do you make it sexy? How do you make it fun? Well, we always continuously try to learn and grow, right? And to maybe bring in different practices and try to always continue for improvement. I think once we do those things, it's, I promise you, we just did our quarterly training at the colony, and we had guys, and at first there was some apprehension of, what it was going to look like. Well, we did two RSI stations plus we call it EMS quick drill, but it's a full base scenario. And truly we get more feedback from the guys that are on the fire side. And they're like, man, this was really great. I came in here. This really wasn't what I was expecting, but this was really good. I learned a lot. And I think it was really, well received. But again, and it's just getting people there and getting the things going and everything in motion, but getting the interest peaked. And sometimes we got to do that by, again, changing things, bringing new things in. Don't stay stagnant. And as far as, training wise, sometimes you got to make it realistic, try to make it as realistic as possible. We do that with simulation, but some mannequins are better than others. Adding in real patients sometimes for whether you're doing MCI scenarios, all those things. But it really, once you put some hands on and people actually get to go through some stuff, it makes it a little bit better, I think.
You said a bunch of things there. I like that you start with medical control. I think that having a medical director, whoever's in charge of your EMS, if they're involved, if they're vocal, if they're interested, if they're a part of what your culture is, that's huge. And we saw that in Fort Lauderdale. I was part of the group that brought on a new medical director. And that guy, even right now, he's just in it. He's in the job. He likes to be on calls. He likes to be involved. He likes to be at meetings. He likes to show up on scene, but he's involved, and he's the guy you can call anytime, ask questions. We get him incorporated to our CQI, our training docs. He weighs in from his side, and sometimes hearing it from a doc versus another medic, you need that difference of perspective. People need to hear from different people other than the standard EMS guys that are going to be into it. So that's huge. And I think you said changes too. That's huge, because I think I was talking to a recent chief over in another department locally, and we were talking about culture. And I'm like, listen, how do you know that your culture is good? Like, what from the EMS side, for example, how do you know your culture is strong? And he gave me some examples. One of the examples I remember, he goes, Steve, I was over at a conference, and the guys that I work with didn't see me, but I heard them talking to another vendor, and they were bragging about how well they do EMS in terms of the new drugs they were carrying, the skills they were performing, like finger thoracotomy or those kind of things. And they were just excited about it. And when he listened to that, them not knowing he was there, he was like, man, whatever I'm doing is right. But it involved keeping up with the times, keeping up with those skills, keeping up with the latest data that comes out. And I'll brag about Florida for a second, especially South Florida. We're damn good at that. The medical directors around here are solid. They're just good. They're involved. They're writing papers. They're involved with their departments. So I'm glad you said that. And this is a funny story. I'm not saying a lot now because you brought up a lot of memories here. But recently, so back in Fort Lauderdale, we were in a phased approach to start giving whole blood, because whole blood's a big thing right now. And BSO, Broward Sheriff's Office, did give it. They had an EMS captain that was giving it. So we were in like stage one, like awareness and getting that coordination with BSO for them to give it for us on scene. And I could try to sell it all day. If I'm out there preaching it, it's like, well, of course you are. You're an EMS guy. Of course you want this stuff. The excitement's not the same as somebody else saying it. Now, what had happened was, one of our battalion chiefs, Mike Salzano, he and his crew were on a call where they had a shooting. BSO showed up and they had to give whole blood together. So it was their first experience with it. And it went great. He jumped into the truck, brought the whole blood, they hooked it up together. He went to the hospital, got to the hospital. The blood actually kept this guy alive longer than would have been if he didn't have the blood. But Mike ended up talking to the trauma surgeons and the people over there, and he's hearing how they appreciate it and they're seeing results. And, oh, you guys are giving blood. That's wonderful. So and Mike's a full-fledged fire guy, okay? So when you got the full-fledged fire guy bought into something in the EMS, you take that and run. So what we did right after that was put together, and if he's listening to this, I hope he's laughing. What we did with that was we put together a post-incident analysis on that call, had him and the crew speaking on it with BSO right next to him about the whole blood. I got to tell you, I got so many interesting comments from that, like positive ones, and most of them were like, oh, so Mike likes it? Yeah, I'm in. And I'm like, definitely not fair, but you use your resources, you use your influencers, and that's powerful too. If you got the ones with influence out there, your informal leaders, and you get them bought in, that's part of that groundswell,
Exactly.
And then you mentioned the training aspect, and that's huge. The realistic, relevant training, whether it's the mannequins or whatever. In terms of for cricothyrotomies, are you using pig necks? Are you using ribs over a balloon for needle decompression and all those kind of things? There's so many things to make it more realistic. And that's huge in terms of like getting them excited about this. It's not just a boring thing. It's exciting. We want them good at their jobs. I always talk whenever I'm talking to, like, let's say medics or even just firefighters in general. I always remember this story about I was on a plane once, and I think we're going to FRI or something. So we're flying over from Atlanta to wherever it was, somewhere in the West Coast. And over the intercom, the pilot goes, "Attention all passengers, there's a medical emergency at the rear of the plane. If there's a doctor on board, please report to the rear of the plane." And of course, since we're going to a fire conference, there's 50 firefighters on board. So what do 50 firefighters do? They get up, get into the line, and they rush down the hall right down to the rear of the plane, right? I think the plane may have done this, may have bowed a little bit. So we all get there, and they handled it, and then we all went back to our seats. But I remember thinking, what was that pilot calling for? Was he really calling for a doctor? Was he calling for a podiatrist, a family medical practitioner, an eye doctor? Maybe an ER doctor, maybe a surgeon, maybe, okay. But what was that pilot actually doing? That pilot was essentially calling 911. And who did that pilot need at that time? They needed a dialed in, knowledgeable EMT or medic to go down there and figure out what the problem is. Because that's what they needed, a first responder, an experienced first responder. And I remember thinking, this job with the fire experience we get and the medical and everything in between makes us that person that even off the job, people rely on. We're that calm center of the storm. And that EMS experience, that's part of that. Those multiple calls we run. And I always used to teach this when I was teaching paramedics that, okay, I want everybody to listen to lung sounds. Okay, normal in class. I'm like, okay, Steve, I know it's normal. I know what normal is. I'm like, good. You know what normal is. So when abnormal hits you, you can identify it right away. You may not know exactly what it is at first, but it's not normal. That's good. The same thing with these BLS calls, these assessments, all these regular calls we run. We're seeing normal all the time. That way, when abnormal hits us, hey, something's not right. I'm not sure what it is yet, but something, my spidey sense is going off, And that's what that EMS does for us. So I'm sorry to drift off into a tangent there, but I'm glad you mentioned those things because it got me thinking about all these things. So I appreciate you answering those questions. In terms of like EMS or like whatever, in terms of your experience with the fire service so far. Oh, you know what? I do want to ask you this. You brought up the single role paramedic thing. I think that if people are listening, they may be questioning what that looks like. Can you just explain what that looks like for a single role medic in your organization at the colony?
Yeah, so at the colony, like I said, it's not about separating the services, and that's what a lot of times when we talk about the single role medic, we used to call it. I think one of the spinoffs was paramedic only, and they're like, "Well, that sounds terrible, right? It's not a paramedic only. You're not just a paramedic, right?" So a single role paramedic in our organization, and the easiest way to explain to people is we're on a fire company, we're at a house, right? We do everything morning pass on with everybody. We do trainings with everybody, whether with our fire company, in my house specifically. I'm paired with a rescue and a truck. So we have meals together, trainings together, chores together. We're part of the house, just like any other. If a fireman comes on, the only difference in our organization is we don't rotate to the backwards guy on the fire apparatus, right? So our focus is EMS. And it's been nice because, like I said, we do trainings now. We're all paramedics in the department. Every firefighter in our department is also a paramedic. So when we do trainings, we're training with them as well. It's all incorporated. When they're at fire trainings, we're not at every single one, but 90% of them we're at doing whatever we would be doing during that training. Or if there's something coordination with them, then that's what we do. If it's extrication training, we are working on how would we implement our patient into this extrication and how would we work together to get the patient out. So it's worked out really extremely well. I wasn't there before the single role paramedic thing was put in place, but talking to our guys, they truly believe that the patient care and the EMS part of the department has been elevated to another level. And that was exactly what Chief Thompson wanted. He wanted to make sure that, we could bring in fire guys that were passionate about firefighting, and we could bring in EMS guys and gals that were passionate about EMS. And that's what we've done, and it's worked out extremely well. I'm not going to tell you it's for every system. Every system's a little different and has their own, the cities has their own needs and wants. But for the city of the colony, it's worked out extremely well. And I think it's a lot more places are looking at it. Some people do it a different way. I've filled a lot of questions. A lot of people call us and want to know how we do it, how it works for us. And they may take it and do different things with it, or they may do pretty much similar. So there's departments doing both. There's some doing exactly what we're doing, and there's some departments doing it and doing peak trucks with it, and putting in system in very large fire-based EMS systems and stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how it all shakes out. But
I love that. I love that you're doing something that a lot of people aren't, and people are feeling free to reach out, and you guys are having those discussions. That's huge, man. And as I think about like this with this fire department growing, I think about what we're doing in the next 2 years and how we're going to make this novel, new, but basically, what do we need to know about what you're doing and what's working? To be quite honest, there's a lot of departments that are doing things that are working, and all across the spectrum, whether it's in the fire side, EMS side, special ops, whatever. And that's important to have those conversations. So I used to ask this question. I used to say, what are your traits of leadership that you apply to, or they come to your mind when I ask that? But I've started to drift away from that to say, Rather, do you have any leadership lessons learned? And you can still answer the traits question, but I think that a lot of the answers I get with the traits are sometimes static, like they'll just say a word or a phrase, but I'd rather hear like why, if that makes sense. So I'll ask the question to you in terms of traits. Do you have any that you think about, but also do you have any leadership lessons learned that have come through this journey?
Yeah, I think obviously, like you said, being a student of leadership, talking about when I went through my bachelor's program, there was leadership classes, and if being completely honest, my prior EMS history and not being in a fire base, like you don't get a lot of that in EMS, classes. As far as there's sadly there's just not a lot in leadership based classes. So I think it's extremely important. I mean, and it's super interesting. I think that's one of those things that continuously reading books and going through. But obviously, I think a leader is somebody that's going to go get the job done, and how they do that obviously is super important too. Having integrity and all those normal leadership things. But I think we were having a discussion the other day at the Firehouse, and I think one of the lessons learned, right, and one of the things I had to learn when I started as a division chief of EMS in Whitesboro is it's easy to say no. Right, when somebody asks for something, that's the easiest response is no. It's a lot harder to say yes, but at the end of the day, as a leader, we are for them, and them being those who we work with, and it shouldn't be no. It should be, well, how can we do that, or why do you want to do that? What is your reasoning behind it? Bring me more research. And that's some of those times slowing down a little bit and saying, hey, you don't have to be a yes right now, but how do we, why and why not? And figuring out a way to get it done basically is to me was a lesson learned. And I think that leads to a lot of conversation, open communication. Obviously, communication is another huge leadership thing, being able to have open communication, and listening. Listening is even more important than talking, right? So being able to listen to your personnel and say, understand, maybe we don't always have to agree. I think that, I've told people, me as a person, leader or not leader, like I'm pretty blunt. I'll tell you how I feel. And, usually sometimes when I tell you in my past, it ain't always been delivered the best. Right. So that's stuff that I've always worked on and try to get better at, but you'll never have a question on my opinion or how I feel about something. Now we can agree to disagree or whatever and go on about it. But again, having those open conversations and listening to your personnel, and again, being open to not just shutting things down and to listening and having those conversations.
I love that you gave the perspective between no versus not yet, like not yes yet. That's, I think, I don't know where I was reading that recently, but that's a powerful concept. And I think I'm glad you brought that up as like an example of something you've learned over time. And I think that's important. And there's a lot to break down with that. I think that when you talk about getting the job done, and first of all, when you talk about like you mentioned earlier that you were given ownership over that first group of single role paramedics, and you kind of, and Chief Thompson empowered you to do what it is, what's building what's now. And that's the same thing, in terms of that analogy there, it's one thing to say no, but it's one thing to say, let's get to yes. Let's figure out how to get to yes. And that drives the conversation. That drives collaboration. That drives communication. Like, how do we get to that yes? So I love that you went there, man. That's something, I guess, and it opens up a whole another chapter of a whole other conversation, right?
Exactly.
But agreeing to disagree, opening conversations. And maybe I'm just being, I'm throwing out generalities here, but I don't know if we do that enough. One of the most recent things I was thinking of is, we have policies, SOPs, procedures on fire, on EMS. Tones go off for fire, we blaze out the door, handle the job. Tones go off for a cardiac arrest, we go out, do our job, knock it out of the park. The times where conversations need to happen at the firehouse or where you work, is there really a policy for that? Is there a protocol that says you must act? And I don't think that's always the case. I think that sometimes the conversations that need to happen sometimes don't. The quote unquote policy isn't followed,
Exactly. Yeah. And that's, like I said, you go down a whole rabbit hole, but, one of the other things that I've, learned from other mentors and people I'm around is, talking about discipline or anything like that, you know, we don't have to, doesn't have to be done today, right this second, right? And that's usually what gets us in trouble. And as far as, you know, we don't have to have a response immediately. Maybe we have to, you know, there's some things that are going to have a response, but the whole response doesn't have to be right this second. And I think that that's, you know, sometimes we need that, you know, let's have some time to think about X, Y, Z, and then have a response. Usually the response is going to be a lot better than making the response when our emotions are super involved. But I think that that's, you know, and going back to it's okay. And then one of my biggest things is, again, I'm blunt, but I'm also not afraid to say, I don't know, you know, we'll find out together. But to me that's, you know, it's okay to be wrong. When I screw up, I'll come and tell you flat out, hey, I screwed the pooch on this one. You know, let's figure it out. I don't know something. I don't know. I'll try to get you an answer. You know, we can work together to get an answer, but at this moment, I don't know. So yeah. I think those are all big things to me.
Yeah, and it's powerful when you as a leader, we as leaders say that, we model behavior, so we make it okay for other people to say, I don't know either. You know, but like I said, I'll find out. This is one of my favorite questions. So, do you have any concerns in the fire service? Like, does anything keep you up at night?
So, fire service and EMS service all together. I think one of the biggest things to my concern right now is, one is, how are we, you know, hiring is getting lower and lower as we already are. And how do we keep people interested in our career field and make sure that we're going to have somebody show up in 20, 30, 40 years whenever we call 911, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's a huge problem nationally that, you know, we're going to be faced with. I think that we're already behind the 8 ball. I think, you know, when you look at departments, you know, 20, 30 years ago, they did a great job, whether it was fire prevention, all these things, you know, as kids. Like I said, there was that moment, but you know, you remember being in school and having fire prevention, and that created interest. I don't know that we're doing enough of that now. And I don't know, and it may be different across the nation at different points. Maybe people are doing a great job, but I think, you know, we are going to have to do better as an industry and as a career field to spark interest in the younger minds. And I was telling somebody the other day, I remember going back and, you know, and myself thinking, you know, you had asked me 5 years ago, what's your thoughts on, you know, us bringing 18-year-olds, you know, with this generation straight into the fire service? And I would tell you, well, I get why people are concerned, because, you know, we see and we do a lot of bad things. Problem is, if we don't bring them in when they're young, nobody in their mid-20s typically is going to say, you know, unless there's a big national event, 9/11 and some of those things that created some interest. But if there's nothing there, then we've done, you know, what are we going to do when there's not people showing up to take tests? And I think that's what we're already starting to see. And I think that's, you know, whether it's, like I said, fire prevention, even EMS, and I'm super huge on, obviously passionate about EMS, but, you know, fire prevention's been the obvious. But now I think you're starting to see more people get out and do more EMS related things out in the schools and stuff like that, and getting people's interest peaked into, you know, the EMS side of things. And I think that's huge, because, you know, you see fire truck, well, yeah, I want to be on a fire truck, but how do we get high schoolers, middle schoolers interested in the EMS side? I think that's one of those things, in doing some public relations, and there's tons of ways to do that, but that just so we can get those people interested in looking at that career field from the beginning.
You know, you that's obviously a huge concern. I'm glad you mentioned that. So in terms of middle school versus high school, I think at one point, I think a lot of people were focused on high school, you know, yeah. And I think most recently, like I'm doing now, I work with a local middle school in the town. And I got to tell you, the middle school has a medical program in middle school. And you realize, wow, that's, you need to get them earlier in high school. You need to get them early, at least have them understand that there's opportunities, whether it's PA, MD, fire, EMS, whatever. You got to get them earlier. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because whereas the longer you wait, you're missing opportunities.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that we're just starting to get kind of get our hands wet with at the colony is we're starting to do, you know, hands-only CPR classes in the school districts. And I think that, you know, our goals are 5th, 8th, and then 12th graders. But, you know, like you said, even at the 5th grade, and we're going out trying to get, obviously, recognition on cardiac arrest and, you know, get some of that low-lying fruit on that end of it. But we're also piquing interest, hopefully, at an earlier age, and getting them asking questions of, you know, well, obviously this is cardiac arrest, this is what we're doing, but why are we doing it? And then how does that transition into a career field? So I think that's super important and hopefully pay off.
Yeah, no, and then like you said, the reason we're even talking about this is because the challenges we're all hiring. What are the ways we can do this? So I'm glad you mentioned that. All right, so we're kind of coming up on the end here, but for you, like, what's next for you, man? What's on your radar that we should keep an eye out?
And I, have FDIC coming up. I was put in again, so for my second year, I'll be teaching aggressive airway management, task tactics, and techniques. So I'm looking forward to that. But that's really what I have on my plate right now, is preparing for that and getting ready for that presentation, and then just continue growing. As an EMS lieutenant at the colony, it's a new role for me. So just continue to do my best I can there, and go forward with our training process and all that stuff there as well.
Awesome, man. All right. Well, listen, I think we talked about an important subject today. I think that, obviously you and I are advocates for like EMS, and whether it's fire-based EMS, single role, whatever, we're advocates. We're excited about it. We're motivated about it. And we always like to see more people, motivated about the job in general, but sometimes EMS gets a bad rap. So I'm glad we talked about different ways to bolster that. As I'm reviewing the notes here, I'm just glad we talked about a bunch of things. We talked about your presentation, and I'm glad that fire engineering's taken it upon themselves to incorporate this into the structure. Like, just because you pull a victim out, it's not over. What are we doing with that victim? How are we treating that victim? How are we completely handling that victim? Everybody says it's about them. Well, what are we doing about them? Not just the property, but them. So I'm glad you started there. I'm glad you went over the details of the single role paramedic. A lot of people have questions on that. And I would encourage anybody who does have questions, you can reach out to Steve. I'm sure he'll give you the answers you need to hear. But it's an interesting concept. I'm glad you're getting the experience for a lot of us that we need to see before determining is that the choice we need to be making. Little things. You mentioned like ownership, how Chief Thompson gave you guys ownership in that first group to develop what you were doing. And that's a powerful thing, letting go and trusting people to develop something. It's not easy for people to do. So the fact that he was able to do that, you've created something beautiful is quite impressive. We talked about the cyano-kit and the treatment there. And obviously, if you go to cyano-kit's website, you can look at all that. But it's a legit part of our treatment protocols. If we're bringing somebody out of fires, that's typically what they need based on what's burning inside there. It's not getting any better. So, I know it's expensive, but, whether there's grants out there, different sources of funding, there's different ways to get those on your trucks, or at least know where they're kept from other organizations, partners, neighbors, and such. I like that we talked about culture. We delved into culture a little bit. The example of the ambulance in the past being down the street and not really being part of that fire-based culture on site, it was something. I'm glad we kind of dove into that and talked about different ways to increase that culture, making them part of the scene, training together, those kind of things. And then we talked and went off on tangents, everything from changes to influencers and realistic training and whatnot. And I'm glad we talked at the end about things like slowing down, listening, the dichotomy between no and not yet, those kind of things. So I'm glad you had the time, man. I'm glad you had time to come out and chat with me on this. I think this is an important topic, and we need more people like us that are passionate about certain things. And EMS is one of them, to be out there as advocates and finding ways to make it more, palatable, make it sexy, whatever you want to call it. But it's what we do out there. And if we're going to do something, why not do it to the best of our abilities, And I think this was chock full of stuff people can walk away with, and that's the goal of these conversations. So man, thank you for being on. Is there any last words, any final thoughts?
Not for me. I truly appreciate the opportunity to talk EMS. Again, give some different perspectives. And like you said, if we're going to do it, let's do it 100%. Let's make sure that it's done right and provide the best care for our citizens. So.
Yeah. And I hope I'm setting a standard here. I hope that people that are watching this podcast on a regular basis realize that, one of the reasons you're on here because you wrote an article. And I try to follow the fire engineering, see what articles out there we're talking about. So more people out there, we keep telling people, write articles. Well, this is how it starts, So, all right. So once again, thank you, Steve, for being on. Thank you for taking the time. To all of the people who listen out there, once again, thank you for listening to the Perspectives on Leadership podcast. We do our best to make the listener walk away with something, or allow the listener to walk away with something tactical. And I think today was one of those days. Second Friday of every month, this episode drops, the Perspectives on Leadership podcast. Thanks once again for listening. Be safe out there, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Breathing in diesel exhaust fumes is like walking into a fire without a mask. Over time, those toxins lead to cancer. Protect yourself with MagneGrip, the easiest, most reliable exhaust removal system that features a true 100% seal to eliminate diesel exhaust fumes. To get free grant assistance, visit MagneGrip.com.
Attention first responders, ready for a new challenge? You can turn your leadership skills into deliciousness by becoming a Firehouse Subs restaurant owner. First responders will receive a $100,000 cash incentive to help open their restaurant. Continue serving after service. Visit firehousesubsfranchising.com today.